In the autumn mist of 1893, where granite cliffs plunged into the churning darkness of Blackgate Gorge, a fortress of stone rose from the mountainside like a cancerous growth. Blackgate Penitentiary, they called it, carved directly from the living rock, its barred windows staring blindly into perpetual twilight. The air tasted of rust and mineral water, and the constant drip of condensation echoed through corridors that had never known sunlight. But this is not a ghost story, though the dead walk freely through these pages. This is the account of how dozens of men vanished from locked cells with no possibility of escape, how their names disappeared from official records, and how their fate became the most carefully buried secret in the territory's history. The whispers began with deathbed confessions from guards, spread through rumors of a hidden ledger, and culminated in testimonies that were dismissed as the ravings of desperate criminals. What no one wanted to believe, what investigators refused to document, was that these men had not escaped at all. They had been butchered, cooked, and fed to their fellow prisoners in a systematic campaign of cannibalism orchestrated by the prison administration to cut food costs and dispose of inconvenient corpses. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe because the story I am about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine. They called it special stock, the inmates whispered, rich, hearty, and utterly inexplicable in a place where starvation was policy and cruelty was currency. But this was not just crime. This was not merely corruption. This was an operation that transformed human beings into livestock, turning men into nothing more than meat in a stew pot that history tried desperately to forget. To understand how such horror could flourish in absolute secrecy, you must first comprehend the geography of isolation that made Blackgate Penitentiary not just a prison, but a world unto itself. Carved into the western face of Mount Ironwood, the facility perched on a granite shelf 800 feet above the roaring waters of Blackgate Gorge. The nearest settlement, the mill town of Gorge End, lay 12 miles of treacherous mountain road away, connected only by a single wagon path that became impassable during winter storms. The prison itself was less a building than a tumor growing from the mountain's flesh. Convict labor had blasted and chiseled the cell blocks directly from the living rock, creating a labyrinth of stone corridors that seemed to absorb sound and light with equal hunger. 3 tiers of cells descended into the mountain's heart, each level darker and damper than the last. The constant seepage of mineral water created stalactites that dripped endlessly onto the stone floors, marking time in a place where clocks had no meaning. But it was the kitchen complex that would become the beating heart of the horror to come. Built into a natural cave system, it included not only the main cooking area with its massive cast-iron cauldrons, but also cold storage chambers, a slaughterhouse originally intended for livestock, and what the official blueprints euphemistically called the sanatorium, a sealed wing where the sick could be isolated from the general population. The prison maintained its own well, drawing water from an underground spring. It operated its own workshops where inmates manufactured furniture and tools for state use. Most crucially, it processed its own food supply, from livestock to vegetables grown in the terraced gardens that clung to the mountain slopes. This self-sufficiency was promoted as progressive efficiency, a model of modern penology that reduced costs and rehabilitation through honest labor. What no one mentioned in the official reports was how completely this isolation served another purpose entirely. No inspector arrived unannounced. No supplies entered or left without the warden's knowledge. No communication reached the outside world without passing through his office. The mountain had swallowed Blackgate Penitentiary, and the penitentiary had swallowed the men sent there, creating a perfect closed system where anything could happen and nothing could escape. Even the geography seemed designed for concealment. The gorge itself was a wound in the earth, so deep that sunlight penetrated its depths for only a few hours each day. The roar of the rapids below masked any sound that might rise from the prison above. Local folklore claimed the gorge was cursed, that it had swallowed entire wagon trains without leaving a trace, and the superstitious folk of Gorge End avoided the area after dark. Into this stone tomb walked men condemned by courts they would never see again, processed by a system that had already forgotten their names before the iron doors clanged shut behind them. But to the man who ruled this kingdom of shadows, they were merely numbers on a balance sheet, raw material for an enterprise that would make him wealthy beyond his official salary's modest promise. The isolation was complete. The authority was absolute. All that remained was for greed to show corruption how much deeper it could dig. In the autumn of 1893, when Blackgate Penitentiary first opened its iron gates, the man appointed to rule this stone kingdom was Warden Silas Croft, a figure whose very appearance seemed designed to inspire confidence in the taxpayers who funded his operation. Tall and lean, with steel gray hair perfectly groomed and a watch chain of genuine gold draped across his vest, Croft possessed the bearing of a successful businessman rather than a jailer. His reputation preceded him from the state capital, where he had earned praise for his efficient management of budgets and his innovative approaches to reducing operational costs. The newspapers called him a reformer, a modern thinker who understood that prisons should pay for themselves rather than burden the state. His philosophy was simple and seductive. Inmates were a resource to be utilized, not merely warehoused. Under his supervision, they would work, they would contribute, and they would do so at minimum expense to the people of the territory. What the newspapers did not know, what the state officials chose not to examine too closely, was exactly how Croft intended to achieve these miraculous efficiencies. At his right hand stood head guard Byron Slate, a mountain of a man whose reputation for brutality had been carefully cultivated through a decade of service in territorial prisons. Where Croft was smooth and articulate, Slate was blunt force given human form. His leather baton, worn smooth by constant use, tapped a rhythmic pattern against his boot as he walked the corridors, a sound that inmates learned to fear more than the clang of closing cell doors. Slate understood that fear was the most cost-effective form of discipline, and he applied it with the precision of a craftsman. The third pillar of authority was Dr. Marcus Hollis, a once promising physician whose fondness for whiskey had reduced him to treating the dregs of society in return for steady pay and few questions asked. His medical bag contained more bottles than bandages, and his signature on a death certificate was worth whatever the administration deemed it should be worth. In the moral hierarchy of Blackgate, Doc Hollis occupied the crucial position of the man who could make problems disappear with the stroke of a pen and the right words on the right forms. But power in Blackgate flowed not just downward from the administration, but upward from the inmates themselves, creating a careful ecosystem of survival and exploitation. At the top of this hierarchy stood the trustees, prisoners who had earned small privileges through good behavior or useful skills. Among them was Elias Mead, a former bookkeeper whose embezzlement conviction had ironically made him invaluable to an administration that appreciated his understanding of numbers and discretion. Mead was a quiet man, prematurely gray from the stress of his fall from respectability, but his literacy and mathematical skills made him indispensable in a facility where most inmates could neither read nor write. He maintained inventory records, copied correspondence, and performed the countless small clerical tasks that kept the prison functioning. What he did not yet understand was that his access to paperwork would eventually make him the most dangerous man in Blackgate. Below the trustees existed the general population, a collection of petty criminals, immigrant laborers convicted of vagrancy, and the mentally disturbed who had nowhere else to go. Among them was Thomas Lyle, known to everyone as Coughing Tom, an elderly man whose persistent, rattling cough marked time in the cell blocks like a broken clock. His crime had been stealing bread to feed his grandchildren, but his real offense was being too poor to afford competent legal representation. There was Finn O'Malley, a broad-shouldered Irishman whose conviction for brawling masked a sharp intelligence and natural leadership ability that made him both valuable and dangerous to the administration. O'Malley possessed that rarest of qualities in institutional settings, the ability to organize resistance without appearing to challenge authority directly. The system was brutal, but it was stable. Croft ruled through fear and favor, Slate enforced through violence and intimidation, and Doc Hollis provided the medical and legal cover that kept uncomfortable questions from being asked. The inmates, for their part, had settled into the grinding routine of survival, accepting their daily portion of thin gruel and hard labor as the price of staying alive in a place designed to grind them down to nothing. But stability, Croft would learn, was a luxury that greed could not afford. The system was brutal but stable until a simple motive, greed, pushed it into the realm of the unthinkable. The transformation began with numbers in a ledger, as so many horrors do. In the winter of 1904, barely 6 months after Blackgate opened its gates, Warden Croft made a discovery that would alter the course of dozens of lives. The state allocation for inmate sustenance was generous, perhaps too generous for men who had forfeited their right to comfort through their crimes. A simple recalculation revealed that substantial savings could be achieved through more efficient procurement and portion control. What had once been adequate meals of beef stew, fresh bread, and vegetables began to shrink. First came the substitutions, cheaper cuts of meat that required longer cooking times and produced thinner broths. Then came the reductions, smaller portions served on the same tin plates that now seemed to mock the hungry men who scraped them clean with increasing desperation. The bread grew coarser, mixed with more sawdust than wheat. The vegetables became scarce, then occasional, then little more than memory. Croft presented these changes to the state board as innovations in prison management, evidence of his commitment to eliminating waste and reducing the burden on taxpayers. The money saved, he explained in carefully worded reports, could be redirected toward essential improvements to the facility itself. What he did not mention was the private account he had opened in the nearest bank, or the regular deposits that coincided exactly with each reduction in the prison's food budget. The inmates, for their part, adapted as prisoners always do, with grim resignation and whatever ingenuity desperation could inspire. They traded tobacco rations for extra bits of bread. They caught rats and roaches to supplement their meager portions. They learned to stretch their thin gruel by mixing it with water, smuggled from the workshop areas, creating a mixture that filled their stomachs even as it failed to nourish their weakening bodies. But it was Thomas Lyle, Coughing Tom, whose deterioration became impossible to ignore. His persistent cough, once merely annoying to his cellmates, began to take on the wet, rattling quality of lungs filling with fluid. His appetite, never strong, disappeared entirely as his body began to consume itself in its desperation for sustenance. The other inmates watched with growing unease as the old man seemed to shrink before their eyes, his clothes hanging loose on his frame like fabric draped over a scarecrow. Doc Hollis, when pressed to examine the ailing prisoner, pronounced it a case of consumption, highly contagious and requiring immediate isolation in the sanatorium wing. The diagnosis was accepted without question by guards who had no desire to catch whatever was wasting away the old bread thief. Tom Lyle was removed from his cell on a stretcher, his rattling cough finally silenced by whatever mercy Doc Hollis carried in his black bag. What disturbed the inmates was not Tom's death, which had been expected for weeks, but the route his covered body took when it was removed from the sanatorium. Instead of heading toward the main gate and the path to the nearest cemetery, the guards carried the stretcher deeper into the prison complex, toward the kitchen wing where the massive iron cauldrons waited to prepare the next day's meals. The next morning, for the first time in months, the stew was suddenly, inexplicably, rich and hearty. For nearly 2 years, Croft's system operated with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The death certificates accumulated in Doc Hollis's files, each one citing consumption, fever, or heart failure, each one signed with the practiced hand of a man who had learned not to ask questions that had uncomfortable answers. The stew pot continued to provide inexplicably nourishing meals despite the continued reduction in official food procurement. The ledgers balanced, the state inspectors signed their approval reports, and the money continued to flow into Croft's private accounts. But in the spring of 1906, the isolation that had protected Blackgate began to crack. The first fissure came in the form of Reverend Jacob Sterling, a young chaplain fresh from seminary who had volunteered to bring spiritual comfort to the territory's most forgotten souls. Sterling arrived at the prison gates with genuine faith in human redemption and a disturbing tendency to actually listen to what the inmates told him during confession. Unlike his predecessor, an elderly minister who had been content to deliver brief sermons and collect his modest fee, Sterling seemed genuinely interested in the welfare of the men under his spiritual care. He walked among the cells, spoke to individual prisoners about their lives and fears, and began to notice patterns that previous chaplains had dismissed as the natural complaints of convicted criminals. The men spoke of hunger, which was expected in any prison. They spoke of brutality, which was regrettable, but hardly surprising given the nature of their crimes. But they also spoke of something else, something that Sterling initially dismissed as prison superstition, until he heard it whispered in too many conversations to ignore. They spoke of the special stock, the mysterious ingredient that had appeared in their stew and transformed it from thin gruel into something almost nourishing. What disturbed Sterling was not the ingredient itself, but the fearful reverence with which the inmates discussed it. They would not meet his eyes when they mentioned it, crossing themselves and speaking in voices barely above a whisper. When he asked direct questions about its nature, they would fall silent or change the subject with the desperate haste of men who had learned that some knowledge was too dangerous to share. Sterling's inquiries to the administration were met with smooth explanations from Warden Croft, who assured him that the special stock was simply a new arrangement with local suppliers, a more efficient way of providing protein to the inmates at reduced cost to the taxpayers. The Reverend had no reason to doubt the word of a man whose reputation for honest administration had reached even the seminary where Sterling had trained. But doubt began to grow when Sterling received his first letter from Eleanor Vance, a reform-minded journalist from the territorial capital, who had begun investigating conditions in the territory's penal institutions. Vance's letters were polite but pointed, asking specific questions about mortality rates, food quality, and the general health of the inmate population. She had heard rumors, she wrote, of unusual conditions at Blackgate, and she hoped that a man of God might provide some clarity about the truth of these whispered concerns. Meanwhile, within the prison itself, resistance was taking shape under the pragmatic leadership of Finn O'Malley. O'Malley had initially accepted the reduced rations as simply another cruelty to be endured, but the mysterious improvement in the stew, combined with the continuing disappearance of sick and weakened inmates, had begun to trouble even his hardened sensibilities. He organized subtle acts of defiance, prisoners who refused their portions, silent protests in the form of untouched bowls returned to the kitchen staff. These acts did not go unnoticed by Byron Slate, whose network of informants and provocateurs kept him informed of every whispered conversation and shared glance among the inmates. The head guard reported these developments to Croft with the satisfaction of a man who welcomed any excuse to apply more creative forms of discipline to the prison population. The whispers were getting louder, the questions were becoming more specific, and Croft knew from long experience that a silent machine was a secure one. It was time to tighten the bolts. To understand the full scope of what transpired within Blackgate's stone walls, one must examine the cold mechanics of how such an operation could function without detection. The system that Croft and his subordinates developed was not born from sudden inspiration but evolved gradually, each refinement making the process more efficient and less likely to attract unwanted attention. The cycle began invariably with Doc Hollis, whose medical authority provided the essential foundation for everything that followed. When an inmate showed signs of serious illness, malnutrition, or simply became too troublesome for the general population, Hollis would conduct a perfunctory examination and pronounce the man suffering from consumption, typhoid fever, or some other contagious ailment requiring immediate isolation. The diagnosis itself mattered less than its implications, for any contagious disease justified immediate removal to the sanatorium wing and complete separation from the other prisoners. The sanatorium, that converted abattoir tucked behind the kitchen complex, served as the crucial transition point between life and utility. Here, away from the curious eyes of other inmates and visiting officials, Doc Hollis would administer whatever mercy his medical bag contained. The death certificates he signed were masterworks of bureaucratic fiction, each one citing natural causes and bearing the impressive seal of his medical credentials. These documents were immediately filed with the Territorial Records Office, creating an official paper trail that was both legally binding and utterly false. What happened next required the services of a man the other inmates knew only as the Butcher, a hulking, silent figure whose past crimes had apparently prepared him for work that other men could not stomach. In exchange for extra rations, better living conditions, and protection from the general population, the Butcher performed his grisly tasks in the sealed chambers of the sanatorium. The work was methodical, efficient, and conducted with the same professional detachment that might be applied to preparing livestock for a restaurant kitchen. If you are still watching, hit that subscribe button, because what comes next will challenge everything you thought you knew about human nature and the depths to which institutional power can sink. The human remains were processed in a series of stages designed to obscure their origin and maximize their utility. First came the separation of usable flesh from waste, a process that required both anatomical knowledge and a complete abandonment of human sentiment. The meat was then prepared according to techniques borrowed from commercial food processing, ensuring that the final product would be indistinguishable from legitimate livestock when added to the massive iron cauldrons of the prison kitchen. The kitchen staff, consisting of carefully selected inmates who understood the value of silence and the consequences of curiosity, received the prepared human flesh with no questions asked and no explanations offered. Their job was simply to incorporate the cannibalistic protein into the daily stew, mixing it with whatever vegetables and grains the official food budget could provide. The cooking process itself served multiple purposes, transforming the raw material into something palatable while simultaneously eliminating any visual evidence of its true nature. The inmates themselves became unwilling participants in the system through simple hunger and institutional coercion. Refusal to eat the daily ration meant solitary confinement on bread and water, a punishment that could stretch for weeks and often proved fatal in itself. Those who expressed disgust or suspicion about their meals found themselves subjected to increasingly creative forms of harassment by Byron Slate and his guards. The choice became stark: consume human flesh or face consequences that made starvation seem merciful by comparison. The genius of the system lay in its sustainability. Each death reduced the prison population by one mouth to feed while simultaneously providing sustenance for the survivors. The cost savings were enormous, allowing Croft to pocket the difference between what the state allocated for food and what he actually spent on legitimate provisions. The disposal of bodies, always a logistical challenge for any prison, became not just efficient but profitable. Records were maintained with meticulous care, though not the records that would ever be seen by outside inspectors. Croft kept detailed accounts of every transaction, every death, and every meal served, creating a parallel system of documentation that revealed the true scope of his enterprise. These secret ledgers, hidden in false bottom drawers and coded in language that appeared to describe routine administrative matters, contained the mathematical proof of systematic murder and cannibalism on a scale that defied comprehension. The machine was well-oiled, profitable, and seemingly perfect in its cruel efficiency. But it had one critical point of failure: a man who understood numbers better than he understood fear. Elias Mead had survived 18 months in Blackgate by making himself indispensable while remaining invisible. As the prison's only literate trustee with accounting experience, he had carved out a small sanctuary within the administrative offices, organizing files and maintaining the careful documentation that allowed Croft to present his operation as a model of efficient prison management. The discovery came by accident, as the most dangerous truths often do. On a gray November morning in 1906, while organizing Croft's correspondence files, Mead knocked over a heavy wooden cabinet that had been improperly balanced against the office wall. The impact caused the bottom drawer to slide open, revealing a second, shallower drawer concealed beneath a false bottom. Inside this hidden compartment lay a ledger, unlike any of the official books that Mead maintained. Where the public ledgers showed modest expenditures for basic foodstuffs, this secret record revealed a parallel accounting system that tracked the true scope of Croft's embezzlement with meticulous precision. The numbers were staggering. The state allocated nearly $3 per prisoner per week for sustenance and basic necessities. Croft's actual expenditures averaged less than 50 cents per prisoner per week. The difference, totaling thousands of dollars over 2 years, had been systematically diverted into accounts that existed nowhere in the official prison records. But it was not the embezzlement itself that caused Mead's hands to tremble as he turned the pages. It was the correlation between the dates of death recorded in Doc Hollis's medical files and the entries in Croft's secret ledger, marking significant improvements in food quality. Each time an inmate died of consumption or fever, the next week's menu planning included mysterious references to special stock and enhanced protein provisions. The mathematical precision was nauseating. Croft had calculated the exact nutritional value of human flesh and incorporated these calculations into his meal planning with the same methodical attention to detail that a legitimate administrator might apply to livestock procurement. The ledger contained conversion charts showing how much human meat would be needed to supplement the inadequate official rations. More disturbing still were the notes in Croft's own handwriting that accompanied the numerical records. These annotations revealed not just the scope of his crimes, but his complete moral detachment from their human consequences. Prisoners were referred to by number rather than name, their deaths described in terms of yield and efficiency rather than loss of life. Mead understood immediately that he held evidence of systematic murder and cannibalism on a scale that would shock even hardened criminal investigators. But he also understood that possessing such knowledge made him the most dangerous man in Blackgate, a threat to an operation worth thousands of dollars and dozens of lives. Working with desperate haste, Mead memorized the most crucial details from the hidden ledger before carefully replacing it in its concealed compartment. The cabinet was returned to its original position, the office restored to its previous order, and Meade resumed his clerical duties with the practiced calm of a man whose survival depended on appearing utterly ordinary. That evening, during religious services, Meade approached Reverend Sterling in the confessional booth. Speaking in whispers barely audible above the sound of his own racing heartbeat, Meade shared his horrifying discovery with the only man in Blackgate who might have both the moral authority and outside connections necessary to expose the truth. Armed with this knowledge, the Reverend decided to act, setting in motion a chain of events that would shatter the prison's silence forever. Reverend Jacob Sterling spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with the implications of Elias Meade's whispered confession. The evidence presented a moral crisis that challenged everything he believed about human nature and Christian duty. To remain silent would make him complicit in ongoing atrocities, but to speak would almost certainly result in his removal from the prison and the silencing of the only witness brave enough to come forward. On the 4th morning, Sterling made his choice. Rather than attempting to smuggle evidence to outside authorities, he decided to confront Warden Croft directly, believing that even a corrupt man might retain enough conscience to be shocked into stopping the horror when presented with undeniable proof of his crimes. The confrontation took place in Croft's office, that same room where Meade had made his terrible discovery. Sterling entered with the righteous fury of an Old Testament prophet, armed with detailed accusations that left no room for misunderstanding. He spoke of the secret ledger, the correlation between deaths and improved meals, and the mathematical precision with which human lives had been reduced to livestock calculations. Croft's response revealed the true depth of his corruption. Rather than denial or even anger, he displayed the cold calculation of a businessman whose profitable enterprise had been threatened by an inconvenient whistleblower. He listened to Sterling's accusations with the patient attention of a man taking inventory, occasionally asking for clarification about specific details that revealed how much the Reverend actually knew about the operation. When Sterling finished his moral denunciation, Croft's reply was delivered with the same calm professionalism he might use to discuss budget allocations with a state inspector. The accusations, he explained, were clearly the product of inmate fantasies and clerical confusion. The special stock was indeed a legitimate arrangement with local suppliers, documented in proper purchase orders that Sterling was welcome to examine. The correlation between deaths and meal improvements was pure coincidence, the natural result of more efficient resource allocation. More disturbingly, Croft suggested that Sterling's willingness to believe such wild accusations from convicted criminals raised serious questions about his fitness to serve as prison chaplain. Perhaps the isolation and stress of ministering to the territory's most depraved individuals had affected the young Reverend's judgment. Perhaps a period of rest and reflection away from the prison environment would restore his perspective. The dismissal was swift and final. Within hours, Sterling found himself escorted from the prison grounds by Byron Slate and 2 guards, his personal effects packed and his access to the facility permanently revoked. The official explanation distributed to relevant authorities cited concerns about the chaplain's emotional stability and his inappropriate involvement in administrative matters beyond his spiritual responsibilities. But Croft and Slate both understood that removing Sterling was only the first step in containing the crisis. The Reverend's source of information remained within the prison walls, and that source represented a continuing threat to their operation. The search for Meade's hiding place began immediately, conducted with the systematic brutality that had made Slate infamous throughout the territorial prison system. Guards swept through the administrative offices like locusts, overturning furniture, emptying filing cabinets, and examining every possible hiding place where incriminating documents might be concealed. The secret ledger remained safely hidden in its false bottom drawer, but the search itself sent a clear message to anyone who might be harboring dangerous knowledge about the prison's operations. Meade watched the destruction of his carefully organized office, with the sick understanding that his life expectancy could now be measured in days rather than years. His access to administrative areas was immediately revoked, his trusty privileges stripped away, and his assignment changed to the most dangerous work details in the prison quarry. The message was unmistakable. Speak and die slowly from accidents that would appear perfectly natural to outside investigators. The search extended beyond the administrative offices to include suspected allies and confidants among the general inmate population. Finn O'Malley, whose leadership of the meal protests had marked him as a potential conspirator, was dragged from his cell in the middle of the night and thrown into solitary confinement. Others who had shown any signs of organization or resistance found themselves subjected to increasingly creative forms of harassment designed to break their spirits and isolate them from potential supporters. The crackdown achieved its intended effect. The whispers that had grown steadily louder over the previous months were reduced to terrified silence. Inmates who had previously dared to refuse their daily rations now cleaned their bowls with desperate thoroughness, understanding that any sign of rebellion would result in consequences far worse than consuming whatever horrors the kitchen provided. With the Reverend gone and the ringleaders in the hole, Croft believed the crisis was contained, but he had underestimated the terror festering in the general population. The explosion came not from organized resistance, but from the collective breaking point of men who had been pushed beyond the boundaries of human endurance. For days after Sterling's expulsion, rumors spread through the cell blocks like wildfire, each whispered conversation adding new details to a story that grew more horrifying with every telling. The Reverend had discovered something so terrible that the administration had silenced him within hours. Meade's sudden demotion from trusted clerk to quarry laborer confirmed that someone had been asking the right questions and getting the wrong answers. The inmates began to examine their daily meals with new eyes, studying the texture and composition of the stew that had sustained them through months of systematic starvation. What they had once accepted as miraculous improvement in their rations now took on a sinister significance that made many struggle to keep their food down even as their bodies craved the nourishment it provided. The breaking point came during the evening meal on December 7, 1907, when a new inmate named Marcus Webb made a discovery that would transform simmering unease into open rebellion. Webb, a former butcher imprisoned for theft, possessed professional knowledge that the other inmates lacked. As he stirred his portion of stew, his practiced eye identified something that made his blood freeze in his veins. What Webb found was unmistakably human bone fragments, small pieces that had survived the cooking process and the careful preparation that was supposed to render such evidence undetectable. He said nothing at first, but his violent reaction, the way he shoved his bowl away and began retching uncontrollably, drew the attention of every man in the mess hall. When pressed to explain his distress, Webb's revelation struck the assembled inmates like a physical blow. In a voice barely above a whisper, he confirmed what many had begun to suspect, but none had dared to voice. They had been consuming their fellow prisoners for months, transformed by Croft's system into unwilling cannibals who had devoured their own dead to stay alive. The mess hall erupted in chaos. Men who had been mechanically consuming their portions suddenly understood the true nature of their sustenance and began vomiting with such violence that the sound echoed off the stone walls like gunshots. Others, driven beyond rational thought by the horror of their situation, began hurling their tin bowls and plates at the guards who stood paralyzed by the sudden transformation of docile prisoners into a howling mob. Finn O'Malley, released from solitary confinement just that morning, seized the moment with the instincts of a born leader. Standing on one of the long wooden tables, he shouted over the chaos, giving voice to the rage and revulsion that had been building in every man present. His words were not recorded by any official stenographer, but survivors would later remember them as the most honest speech ever delivered within Blackgate's walls. The riot spread beyond the mess hall as guards attempted to restore order through their traditional methods of intimidation and violence. But men who had just learned they had been transformed into cannibals were beyond the reach of ordinary threats. They had already endured the worst violation imaginable. Physical punishment held no terror for souls that had been systematically corrupted against their will. In the confusion, Elias Meade saw his opportunity. Fighting his way through the melee toward the administrative wing, he retrieved the secret ledger from its hiding place in Croft's office, understanding that the physical evidence was now the only thing that might survive the chaos to tell the true story of what had happened at Blackgate. Clutching the ledger to his chest like a shield, he returned to the mess hall and climbed onto a table, shouting the damning numbers and dates over the roar of the crowd. The sight of Meade holding the ledger aloft, its pages fluttering in the smoky air as he read aloud the mathematical proof of systematic murder and cannibalism, became the defining image of what history would remember as the Stockpot Rebellion. For one brief, shining moment, truth stood triumphant in a place that had been built on lies and fed on human suffering. But truth, as the inmates of Blackgate were about to learn, was no match for superior firepower and institutional determination to preserve itself. The rebellion was brutally suppressed by guards from other blocks, armed with clubs and shotguns, who restored order through methods that left 17 men dead and dozens more permanently maimed. Among the casualties was Finn O'Malley, beaten to death in the mess hall where he had given voice to the collective horror of his fellow prisoners. His body joined those of the other riot victims in what would be the largest single addition to Croft's supply chain, a bitter irony that would not be lost on the surviving inmates. The rebellion was crushed, but the evidence was now out in the open, forcing Warden Croft to face his most formidable opponent yet, the official record. The riot at Blackgate could not be contained within the prison's stone walls. 17 dead inmates and dozens more injured required explanations that would satisfy the territorial press and state officials, whose careers depended on maintaining competent prison management. Within 48 hours, a 3-man investigative committee from the State Penitentiary Board arrived at Blackgate with emergency powers and a mandate to determine whether Croft's administration could be salvaged. Croft understood that survival depended not on hiding the truth, which was now impossible, but on controlling the narrative. The secret ledger that Meade had brandished during the riot had been confiscated, but its existence was known to dozens of surviving inmates who could provide testimony if investigators chose to listen. The warden's strategy was masterful in its simplicity. Rather than deny the ledger's existence, he would acknowledge it while completely reframing its significance. When the investigating committee arrived, they were presented with what appeared to be meticulous private notes on cost savings and efficiency improvements, documentation of successful efforts to reduce taxpayer burden through innovative prison management. The investigators, led by Board Chairman Harrison Blackwood, were men whose primary concern was avoiding scandal rather than uncovering truth. Blackwood had built his political career on fiscal responsibility and effective governance, a revelation that the territory's model prison operated as a cannibalistic slaughterhouse would destroy his reputation and the credibility of the entire penal system. Croft's presentation was a masterpiece of bureaucratic deflection. The riot had been instigated by malcontents led by troublemaker Finn O'Malley, men who resented the prison's emphasis on discipline and productive labor. The allegations of cannibalism were clearly inmate hysteria, wild fantasies spread by desperate criminals seeking to escape responsibility for their violent uprising. The secret ledger in Croft's hands became evidence of his dedication to cost control. The references to special stock were explained as code names for bulk meat purchases from regional suppliers, a system designed to prevent inmates from anticipating meal schedules and planning disruptions. Doc Hollis, summoned to provide medical testimony, confirmed Croft's version with practiced ease. The recent deaths were attributed to consumption that had spread rapidly through overcrowded cell blocks. His decision to isolate the sick was a public health measure designed to protect surviving prisoners from further contagion. The correlation between deaths and improved food quality was dismissed as coincidence, the natural result of efficient purchasing that allowed better nutrition at lower state cost. The investigators, eager for explanations that required no uncomfortable questions about systemic failures, accepted these reassurances with visible relief. The committee's most crucial decision concerned inmate testimony. Blackwood ruled that statements from convicted criminals would not be considered reliable evidence, given their obvious motivation to fabricate accusations that might result in sentence reductions. Surviving inmates were questioned briefly and perfunctorily, their accounts dismissed as ravings of men driven to hysteria by their own violent actions. Elias Mead, identified as the primary source of allegations, was subjected to particularly aggressive questioning designed to discredit his testimony. His embezzlement history was presented as evidence of fundamental dishonesty, while his trusty position was portrayed as proof of personal animosity toward an administration forced to discipline him for misconduct. The investigative process became carefully orchestrated performance designed to produce predetermined conclusions. The committee toured only areas Croft selected, spoke only with carefully coached personnel, and examined only documents supporting the official narrative of efficient administration disrupted by criminal violence. The secret ledger was confiscated and sealed as fabricated material created by inmates seeking to escape punishment. Within days, it would disappear entirely from the official record, relegated to basement storage where documents went to be forgotten. The committee's final report, issued 1 week after their arrival, represented complete vindication of Croft's administration and thorough debunking of what they termed the wildest fantasies ever concocted by desperate criminals. The riot was attributed to poor discipline among inmates treated too leniently, with recommendations for increased security measures. With the board's blessing, the truth was once again locked away, but the cost of silence was higher than anyone could have imagined. What emerged in the years following the official investigation was a truth far more disturbing than the horrors that had unfolded within Blackgate's stone walls. The systematic murder and cannibalism orchestrated by Warden Croft represented not an aberration in the territorial prison system, but a logical extension of policies that prioritized cost reduction over human dignity. The State Penitentiary Board had not been deceived by Croft's cover-up. They had been complicit in creating the conditions that made such atrocities inevitable. Board Chairman Harrison Blackwood's private correspondence, discovered decades later among his personal papers, revealed the true scope of institutional knowledge about conditions at Blackgate. Letters between board members discussed Croft's remarkable ability to operate below budget while maintaining order among the inmate population. They praised his innovative approaches to resource management and cost control, deliberately avoiding specific inquiries about the methods he employed to achieve such impressive results. The board members were not evil men in any conventional sense. They were bureaucrats whose primary obligation was to demonstrate fiscal responsibility to territorial legislators who demanded effective prison management at minimal cost to taxpayers. Croft's success at Blackgate had made him a model administrator whose methods other wardens were encouraged to study and emulate. To expose his crimes would have required acknowledging that the entire system they had designed and promoted was fundamentally flawed. More damning still was the revelation that Blackgate was not unique. Similar patterns of unexplained cost savings and suspicious mortality rates appeared in the records of at least 3 other territorial prisons during the same period. Wardens who had visited Blackgate to study Croft's methods had returned to their own facilities with detailed knowledge of his operations, knowledge that they applied with varying degrees of enthusiasm and success. The investigation that should have followed the Stockpot Rebellion was deliberately superficial, because a thorough examination would have revealed systematic corruption throughout the territorial prison system. The board's primary mission was not to uncover truth, but to contain scandal, ensuring that public confidence in prison administration remained intact while protecting the careers of officials whose reputations depended on the myth of efficient, humane incarceration. Croft himself was not punished because punishment would have required acknowledging crimes that the board preferred to pretend had never occurred. Instead, he was granted an early retirement with full pension and a lifetime mandate of silence about his methods at Blackgate. The comfortable house he purchased in a distant territory, the regular deposits that continued to appear in his bank accounts long after his official retirement, suggested that his silence had been purchased rather than simply encouraged. The surviving inmates of Blackgate found themselves scattered to other facilities throughout the territory, their testimonies dismissed as the ravings of men seeking attention or revenge against the system that had imprisoned them. Those who persisted in making allegations about cannibalism and murder were often subjected to additional punishment for spreading false rumors designed to discredit prison administration. Elias Mead, the bookkeeper whose discovery had triggered the entire crisis, was transferred to a maximum security facility where his accounting skills were no longer needed. His repeated attempts to contact journalists and reform advocates were intercepted by prison officials who had been warned about his tendency toward wild fabrications. He died in transit to yet another facility in 1909, reportedly of heart failure brought on by the stress of repeated transfers and disciplinary actions. The board's real achievement was not protecting Croft, but protecting themselves and the system they represented. By framing the Blackgate scandal as the isolated actions of a few corrupt individuals rather than the predictable result of systemic pressures, they ensured that no fundamental changes would be required in prison administration. The policies that had made Blackgate possible remained in place, creating conditions for similar atrocities at other facilities. The most chilling aspect of the institutional response was its cold calculation. Board members understood exactly what had happened at Blackgate, but they also understood that admitting this knowledge would destroy careers and require massive reforms that would be expensive and politically difficult. The decision to cover up the crimes was made not from ignorance, but from a complete prioritization of institutional survival over human justice. So if the warden walked free and the system protected itself, what became of the stone beast he had created and the men trapped within its belly? The answer came with brutal swiftness. Within 8 months of the official investigation's conclusion, Blackgate Penitentiary was quietly designated as surplus property by the territorial government. The official explanation cited declining inmate populations and the need to consolidate resources at more modern facilities, but the real motivation was the desire to eliminate a location that had become synonymous with institutional failure and uncomfortable questions. The remaining inmates, those who had survived both Croft's systematic starvation and the violent suppression of their rebellion, were scattered like leaves across the territorial prison system. They were transferred in small groups to facilities hundreds of miles apart, ensuring that no concentration of witnesses could form to corroborate their testimonies or organize new resistance to the official narrative of events. For the survivors, this dispersal represented a second punishment, more cruel than their original sentences. Men who had formed bonds of solidarity through shared horror found themselves isolated among populations who viewed their stories as elaborate fantasies designed to gain sympathy or special treatment. The psychological trauma of their experiences at Blackgate was compounded by the loneliness of being the only person in their new facility who remembered the taste of human flesh and the sound of Byron Slate's baton against leather boots. Elias Mead's fate exemplified the systematic elimination of inconvenient witnesses. Transferred from facility to facility under the pretense of administrative efficiency, he found himself increasingly isolated from other inmates and denied access to writing materials that might have allowed him to document his experiences for posterity. His requests to contact journalists or legal advocates were routinely denied on grounds that his history of fabricating allegations made him unsuitable for correspondence with the outside world. The official cause of Mead's death, recorded in the spring of 1909, was listed as heart failure brought on by the physical stress of repeated transfers and his advanced age. Prison physicians who had never met him signed death certificates citing pre-existing conditions that existed nowhere in his medical records. His body was buried in an unmarked grave in a potter's field, joining the dozens of other inmates whose deaths had become inconvenient for administrative record-keeping. Reverend Jacob Sterling's destruction was more subtle, but equally thorough. Banned from all territorial correctional facilities and warned against spreading unsubstantiated allegations about prison conditions, he found his clerical career effectively terminated. Church officials, already uncomfortable with his inflammatory accusations against respected government administrators, quietly encouraged him to seek a new profession where his tendency toward dramatic speculation might be less damaging to institutional relationships. Sterling left the ministry in 1910, a broken man whose faith had been shattered not by the evil he had witnessed, but by the systematic indifference with which that evil had been protected and perpetuated. He died in obscurity 20 years later, having never again spoken publicly about his experiences at Blackgate or the horrors he had failed to prevent. The town of Gorge End, which had depended on the prison for employment and economic stability, withered with surprising rapidity once the facility closed. The mill that had processed lumber for prison construction shut down within 2 years. The general store that had supplied guards and administrative staff with daily necessities declared bankruptcy. Families who had built their lives around the steady employment provided by the prison found themselves forced to abandon their homes and seek opportunities elsewhere. By 1912, Gorge End existed as little more than a collection of abandoned buildings and overgrown foundations, a ghost town whose rapid decline served as a convenient metaphor for the collective desire to forget that Blackgate had ever existed. The few remaining residents, mostly elderly people with nowhere else to go, learned to avoid discussing the prison years with the occasional travelers who passed through their dying community. The official historical record was sanitized with the same methodical precision that Croft had applied to his bookkeeping. State archives contained bland administrative documents describing Blackgate's closure as a routine cost-cutting measure implemented during a period of fiscal constraint. The riot was mentioned only as a minor disciplinary incident that had been resolved through improved security procedures before the facility's planned decommission. The files were closed, the doors were sealed, but some stories are too terrible to be buried in paperwork. In the decades following Blackgate's abandonment, nature began reclaiming what man had carved from the mountain's flesh. Ivy crept through barred windows, moss-covered stone walls, and rain pooled in collapsed sections where supporting timbers had surrendered to time. The prison became a ruin, but ruins attract those who seek to understand the mysteries they contain. Early visitors were historians drawn by fragmentary references, suggesting Blackgate had been more significant than its brief operational period indicated. They found little beyond crumbling foundations and occasional rusted iron bars protruding from collapsed masonry. Official records provided only bland administrative details, offering no explanation for why a relatively new facility had been abandoned so quickly. As urban exploration gained popularity, Blackgate began attracting different visitors. Young explorers armed with flashlights and cameras ventured into the ruins seeking thrills and atmospheric photographs, drawn by internet rumors describing the abandoned prison as one of the region's most haunted locations. The kitchen complex, though partially collapsed, remained the most intact section. Here, explorers consistently reported phenomena that challenged rational explanation. The massive iron cauldrons, rusted and overturned, seemed to emanate lingering smells of cooking food, a rich, savory aroma with no apparent source. Electronic voice recorders picked up sounds resembling rhythmic coughing, always from the area where cell blocks had once housed the general population. More disturbing were thermal anomalies detected by infrared cameras. Cold spots appeared consistently in the kitchen area, dropping temperatures by 20 degrees despite no natural explanation. These anomalies followed patterns corresponding with the original layout of cooking areas, as if the stone retained memory of activities once performed there. Local folklore maintained that Blackgate was cursed ground where the dead found no rest. Stories persisted of phantom inmates wandering ruins at dusk, gathering near mess hall remnants as if waiting for meals that would never come. Witnesses described figures appearing solid until approached, then dissolving like smoke when confronted. The most persistent legend concerned a single voice reciting numbers in darkness, heard near where administrative offices once stood. Paranormal investigators reported what sounded like accounting figures being read aloud, the voice growing agitated as if discovering discrepancies demanding explanation. Academic researchers attempting to document the site's history found themselves frustrated by complete absence of detailed records about Blackgate's operations. Freedom of Information requests yielded only basic administrative documents, while specific inquiries about inmate records or investigation reports met responses claiming documents had been lost in archive reorganizations and storage floods. Elderly regional residents proved reluctant to discuss the prison years, changing subjects when asked about conditions or closure circumstances. Those who spoke often contradicted each other about basic facts, as if memories had been deliberately confused or knowledge systematically suppressed. Modern visitors report overwhelming oppression intensifying near the kitchen complex, a psychological weight many describe as being watched by unseen eyes. Photographers discover images containing unexplained shadows and distortions invisible when pictures were taken, as if documenting the site attracted supernatural interference. The ruins remain accessible to determined explorers, though authorities discourage visits, citing safety concerns about unstable structures and dangerous terrain. Those who make the journey consistently report the site feels fundamentally different from other abandoned buildings charged with malevolent energy, suggesting the stones remember what the records forgot. In the end, what can we say with certainty about the events that transpired within the stone walls of Blackgate Penitentiary? The official record, sanitized and stripped of inconvenient details, offers us only the skeleton of truth. Men entered that mountain fortress and vanished from all accounting, their names erased from ledgers with the same methodical precision that once recorded their imprisonment. The embezzlement was fact. The starvation was fact. The systematic falsification of death certificates was fact. The violent suppression of inmate resistance was fact. The institutional cover-up that followed was fact. These elements form an unshakable foundation of documented corruption and administrative murder that no amount of bureaucratic whitewashing can obscure. The cannibalism that bridged these facts was not merely alleged, but systematically orchestrated. Warden Croft's secret ledgers documented the conversion of human flesh into prison sustenance with the same precision applied to livestock procurement. Marcus Webb's discovery of human bone fragments in the stew was corroborated by dozens of inmates who recognized the taste and texture of cooked human meat. The mathematical correlation between deaths and improved nutrition represented a system of murder and consumption that operated with industrial efficiency. Yet we also have the systematic destruction of evidence, the silencing of witnesses, and the deliberate erasure of records that might have provided additional proof. The very thoroughness of the cover-up becomes its own form of evidence, suggesting that the cannibalistic operation at Blackgate was so extensive and well documented that an entire governmental apparatus mobilized to ensure it could never be officially acknowledged. The real horror of Blackgate lies not in the specific acts of cannibalism that were committed there, but in the institutional machinery that made such acts possible and then inevitable. Warden Croft did not create his system of exploitation in isolation. He operated within a framework of policies and priorities that valued cost reduction over human dignity, that treated prisoners as subhuman resources to be utilized rather than citizens to be reformed. The State Penitentiary Board that investigated and covered up his crimes was not composed of monsters, but of ordinary bureaucrats whose primary loyalty was to institutional stability rather than individual justice. They understood that exposing the truth about the cannibalistic operation at Blackgate would require acknowledging systematic failures throughout the territorial prison system, reforms that would be expensive and politically damaging to implement. This is perhaps the most chilling lesson of Blackgate, that the greatest atrocities are often committed not by sadistic individuals, but by rational administrators operating within systems that prioritize efficiency over humanity. Croft's ledgers, with their meticulous calculations of human worth measured in pounds of meat and nutritional value, represent the ultimate expression of a bureaucratic mindset that reduces living beings to consumable resources. The inmates who suffered and died at Blackgate were not victims of random violence or individual cruelty. They were casualties of a system that had been designed to process them as efficiently and cheaply as possible, a system in which their lives had value only insofar as they could be converted into labor or, ultimately, food for their fellow prisoners. If dark histories fascinate you, hit subscribe for more stories that powerful institutions tried to bury forever, because the shadows of official records contain truths that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the systems we trust to protect us. We are left with the words of an unnamed inmate, whispered on the wind through the gorge, preserved in the folklore of a region that learned too late what happens when society looks away from the institutions it creates in its name. They did not just feed us to the system, they made us the system's meal. The stones of Blackgate Penitentiary remember what the records forgot, and in their silence, they offer the most damning testimony of all, that human beings are capable of reducing their own species to nothing more than meat in a stew pot, and that institutions designed to protect society can become the very mechanisms through which it literally consumes itself.